Hello everyone, my name is Bhante Akaliko and welcome to Lokanta Vihara, the monastery at the end of the world. I'm very pleased to be presenting this talk today for the Buddhist Library on Samvega and spiritual urgency. So this was a theme that we decided on before the COVID-19 pandemic happened, but one that has taken on a bit more significance since. So this term Samvega might be new to you. Many Buddhists don't know this term, but it's something that they perhaps can understand looking at Buddhism, something that pops up in lots of different ways throughout the spiritual path. And I'll touch on some of those themes today. It's actually quite a difficult theme to pin down an exact meaning for, because it does have such a wide variety of contexts and has been applied to different, a whole variety of themes as well. And many translators, when they come to translate it, they use very different terms. So I think one translator, Tanisaro, said there isn't an exact English word for this translation, this word Samvega. And so it's very difficult to define. And of course, translators, when they translate, they often don't translate just one word, they translate the whole passage. And so the definition can change according to the context. So I'll explore a few of those different contexts today and in the conversation that will occur on Zoom after this. But to start with, I wanted to throw out some of the definitions that of Samvega, some of the translations that have been used, to help give an introduction to the idea. So some translators use the term religious emotion, spiritual emotion. Other translators use spiritual awe or aesthetic shock. Sometimes it can be a sense of dismay, of sadness. Other times it can be galvanizing, stimulating, spurring you on. So it comes from this etymological root of being stirred, being shaken, quaking. And so it often seems to be used in reference to situations, events, places, ideas that somehow make us quake on the inside, that shake us up, stir us about, and make us feel a little bit agitated. Maybe the hair on our skin rising up, that goose flesh that we feel when we experience something uncanny. So these are all different ways that Samvega is used. Some of the themes that Samvega is applied to are places, such as the places where the Buddha was born, where he attained enlightenment, where he gave his first sermon, and where he passed away. So these are places that might inspire Samvega. At the time of the Buddha, people were also inspired just by the sight of the Buddha. This was enough to stir people up and make them want to practice the spiritual path. But one of the most common themes that Samvega is used in conjunction with is the themes, the big three: old age, sickness, and death. So this is where I want to focus the short talk today on Samvega, this theme which is often combined: old age, sickness, and death. So these are three things that the Buddha said that we can't escape from in life, something that we all have to face. But for some reason, we tend to forget about these things. Old age is something that we think won't happen to us for a long time, but even me at the age of 43, I'm starting to feel the effects of aging. You know, my body sometimes aches, it gets stiff, I feel tired, it's hard to move around. I can't imagine what it's going to be like if I make it to 80. And we live in a society that's obsessed with youth. We praise youth, we celebrate youth, we try to keep this body looking young and youthful for as long as possible. We hide our old people away. It's rare to see an old person starring in a movie. We don't see old people on TV. And quite often in Western countries as well, we don't have old people living with us in our homes anymore. So it's hard for us to see old age. It's easy to forget about. It's easy to think that this is something that won't happen to us. The same thing with sickness. Sickness is something that we think is foreign to our body, that shouldn't happen, doesn't belong in the body. But of course we know that the body gets sick all the time. This is something that we can't escape. Just as with old age, this body is constantly getting older, this body is constantly getting sick. And so this is something that we can't escape, something that's bound to happen. And even with the COVID-19, we have somehow managed to think that we can escape sickness. If only we can just reorganize our entire society by changing the way we work, by social distancing, by not kissing hello, not hugging, not shaking hands. We think that we can avoid sickness. And sure, it might help to avoid colds, flus, or COVID-19, but sickness is something that we can't escape. And so even though we have tried to prevent this pandemic from getting many people sick, it's not as though we have entirely escaped sickness. Which leads me to the next one, which is death. And this is another thing that our society doesn't like to think about. We don't like to talk about death. We rarely in this culture, in the West, see corpses. We don't like to think that death is something that's going to happen to us. We like to live each day as if this will be a day that we don't die. But one day, it's bound to be a day that we do die. So these three things are difficult to think about, perhaps. They're things that we have some fear around ourselves. We are happily going on as if these things won't happen to us. But if we think like this, we're missing out on an opportunity to develop on the spiritual path, and to develop some wisdom. If we think that old age, sickness and death are things that won't happen to us, then we're missing an opportunity to develop our spiritual practice. Why? Because it's the certainty of these things that changes the way we perceive our life. It's the certainty of these things that should cause us to pause, that should make us think, how am I living? What am I doing with my life? So in a way, Samvega is this opportunity to really deepen our understanding of what it means to be alive, what the purpose of our life is. And this is illustrated in the story that's often told about the Bodhisattva, the Buddha-to-be. When he grew up, he was living in a palace, coddled and secluded from the realities of the world. He never left the palace grounds. He never saw what life is like outside. And then one day he escaped with his chariot driver, and they're touring around the city. And there the Buddha saw an old person for the first time. He saw a sick person for the first time, and a corpse. And he experienced Samvega, this spiritual urgency, a kind of crisis, a spiritual emotion, a shock, some awe. What's going on? Is this what life is? Is this what will happen to me? And the fourth sight that he saw was a sage, an ascetic, someone practicing the spiritual path. So these three things, old age, sickness and death, are a cause of fear, anxiety, spiritual emotion. But this fourth sight, the sage, this is the path away from those things, the path that leads, the Buddha said, to not aging, to not getting sick, to not dying. And this is the path that leads to liberation, nibbana, the deathless. And so this is what the Buddha ended up doing. He ended up using this experience of being confronted by old age, sickness and death to propel him onto the spiritual path and lead him away from suffering towards freedom. And this might seem like a very lofty kind of aim, but this is something that perhaps we've all experienced a little bit of in our life. We've all experienced some Samvega. We've all had this urgency in our heart, this uncanny feeling that something's not quite right, that there's this strangeness that comes over us thinking about old age, sickness or death, that moves us, that makes us question, what is my life about? What am I doing? How am I living? And this is sometimes what brings many people to the spiritual path. It's as if an illusion has been dispelled. I was thinking the other day about the movie The Wizard of Oz, and a scene where Dorothy and her friends are in the palace and they see this great Oz, this great wizard, is just a man with a microphone behind a curtain. And he says, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. But of course, once we've seen behind this veil, once we've seen behind this illusion, it's something that we can't unsee. It's something that should affect us, something that should move us and make us move in a different direction, something that should change the way we live. But unfortunately for us, quite often we see something like we attend a funeral, we think, oh my goodness, this is what will happen. This is what will happen to me. My friends, everyone I know will die. And then we spend some time contemplating this, but very quickly we forget. We get sick and we think, oh, this is terrible, this is terrible, this is life, this is suffering. And then pretty soon, once we're healthy again, we forget. And then when we get sick, we're shocked. And the same with old age. We experience a few aches and pains, and then we think, oh, I'm getting old. But then we get better and we think, oh, well, my body's fine. It'll be fine yet. We maybe get a new limb, like a prosthetic knee or a hip. And we think, oh, we're doing fine. But in the end, all of these things are inescapable. And it's the willful ignorance that allows us to keep hiding it from ourselves. The Buddha illustrated this by saying that if we can just maintain mindfulness of death for the moment it takes to inhale and exhale, then we've done a really good job. It's so easy to forget about these things. It's so easy to have a moment where we truly see the truth of old age and sickness and death. It's so amazing to have that experience, but then it's so easy, so quickly forgotten. And we see that with the COVID-19 pandemic. We see people experiencing this sudden awareness that, wow, our life is so uncertain. Who knows what can happen? We couldn't have predicted that a few months ago our entire society would be shut down. We couldn't travel, we can't go to work, can't shake hands, can't see friends. We couldn't have predicted that. But yet how quickly that feeling of uncertainty and dread and anxiety and terror of sickness and death, how quickly those fears have subsided. How quickly we've become accustomed to this new normal. And so this is a kind of wasted opportunity if we don't use this as a vehicle to move us forward in our practice. And certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, there were many people reaching out to us here, wanting to do meditation, wanting to hear spiritual teachings. So it's a very profound opportunity for people to really harness the potential of this experience of Samvega and to move forward, move deeper, more profoundly onto the spiritual path. This is a topic that the Buddha actually talked about in a simile called the simile of the thoroughbred. It's in the Anguttara Nikaya 4s, I think 113. It's a simile about a horse and different types of horses, which he compares to different types of people. So he says that there's a type of horse who is a very quick learner. And the way you know it's a quick learner is because when they're training horses, elephants, buffalo, other creatures, they, in the old days and still today, they used what's called a goad, G-O-A-D, goad. So a goad was a very long pole, and it had a point at the end, a very sharp point, and often a little rounded hook as well. So it was a very mean instrument that they used to train the animal through pain. They stick the goad into the flesh of the animal. And so pretty soon, through cruelty, this animal learns, when I'm touched with the goad, I should move. I should startle into movement. And so the Buddha talks about this first horse, this thoroughbred, which is a quick learner. This horse has learnt that when it just sees the shadow of the goad, just the shadow, it startles itself into action and moves forward. So the Buddha says that this horse is like a person who, having heard that in the next village someone has died, this person is stirred, is moved, experiences Samvega, knowing that someone has died, just hearing that they've died, stimulates them, makes them develop some urgency and some wisdom. I too will die. How am I living? How am I living my life? What should I do? How should I move? So this is the first horse, the first type of person, quick learners. The second type of horse is the horse that doesn't tremble and move at the shadow of the goad, but instead needs to be pricked a little bit, needs to feel that goad on its hairs, on its skin. So a little slower than the first horse in terms of learning, a little less wisdom. Similarly, the person that the Buddha talks about here is the kind of person who hasn't heard about someone dying, but has seen someone die in front of them. A stranger, someone they don't know. And this person is a quick learner. They think, okay, this could happen to me. Not as quick as the person having heard. They take a little bit more to really make an impact on their mind. But seeing it there, a person dead, affects them, causes them to be stirred, to experience Samvega. The third type of horse, again a little bit slower in learning, requires for that goad to go into its flesh before it starts to move. That means it has to experience some pain, some suffering, before it realizes, yes, I should move. This kind of person, the Buddha says, is like a person who doesn't hear about someone who has died, doesn't see someone who's a stranger who has died, but sees someone they know, a family member, a friend, dead before them. And for many of us, this is how we experience the urgency of understanding death. We don't get moved by it when we hear that someone has died overseas. We don't get moved when we know a stranger has died. If we see a dead person on the street, it might not affect us. But when it's a friend, when it's a family member, someone that we're attached to, invested in, then suddenly it matters. We don't go to any old funeral that's happening. We go to funerals of people that we know, people that we care about. Why? Because the attachment that we have to them is directly proportional to the amount of suffering it causes us, the amount of pain it causes us. It's like our understanding of death is through that pain, through that suffering. It takes a little jab deep into our skin to jolt us into the awareness of death, the likelihood of it happening to us. And then the fourth horse is the slowest of all. This horse doesn't just tremble and move at the shadow, doesn't tremble when it feels the goad on its hairs, doesn't move when it feels the prick into its flesh, but only when that goad is pushed deep into the flesh, so deep that it touches the bone. Only then does that horse suddenly realize, I should move. A very slow learner. And this person, the Buddha says, is the kind of person who doesn't appreciate the truth of death until they are starting to experience it themselves. At that moment of death, only then does it seem very real to them as they lie there on their deathbed, as they fall and stumble with a heart attack, knowing that they're going to die. Only then does it start to be real. And of course, this urgency from understanding death is not going to be useful in the final moments of our life. This urgency that we can develop from Samvega is useful if it changes the way that we live, if it makes us understand, my time here is short. Who knows how long I'll live? Who knows how long I'll be well? Who knows how long it will be before my body starts to get old and infirm? So knowing this, it should change our life. It should stimulate us, make us feel urgency about our spiritual practice. And the reason for this is because of karma. We worry about how we should live because we're worried about the results of our actions. If we keep on putting off good actions like generosity, kindness, good speech, making merit, developing our mind through meditation, reading the teachings, hanging out with wise people, learning more about the spiritual path, if we put all of these things off, then we're missing an opportunity to develop. If we think, I'll do that later, I'll do that when I'm old, I'll do that when I'm feeling better, I'll do that when I'm not bothered by all the exciting things in life. If we think like that, then we're missing out on this opportunity. So we're missing out on the opportunity to create good karma. And that good karma is going to benefit us in this life and also in the next life. So this idea of Samvega has a moral, ethical dimension to it. If we're suddenly aware of the truth of old age, sickness and death, then it should affect us. And it should make us question how we're living. What are we doing with our lives? So in another sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, it's a Maranasati sutta, where the Buddha talks about the likelihood of accidents befalling us, and this idea of how it will affect us and how it should affect our practice. So he talks about a monk at the end of the day looking back over their day and thinking, what have I done? How have I lived? And then thinking, what could happen to me? I could get bitten by a scorpion. I could get bitten by a centipede. I could get food poisoning and get really sick. I could experience really bad diseases in the body. I might get attacked by humans or ghosts. And then this would be a problem for me. I might die from these things. And then the monk reflects, are there any bad, unskillful qualities in my mind? And if so, the Buddha says this person should stir up this Samvega, this sense of urgency. He says you should practice as if your clothes are on fire. Practice this as if your head is on fire. So if your head is on fire, you practice urgently. You practice with enthusiasm, with determination, with effort. And you try to make as much energy towards the spiritual path as you can. The reason for this is if we don't, we'll lose those opportunities to develop. And if we do have good qualities in our mind, if we do practice generosity, if we practice kindness, right speech, if we develop our meditation practice, then we have beautiful qualities that sustain us and support our well-being, our happiness, our joy for life. We have qualities that benefit ourselves and benefit others. And these qualities will benefit us now and in the future. And so this is why we develop Samvega, is to make sure that we make the most of our time, that we don't put off our spiritual development to some future moment where we think the causes and conditions will be more supportive. What we've got now is an opportunity. Who knows how long this opportunity will last? Who knows how tomorrow will pan out? Who knows if we get sick? Who knows how old age will affect us? Who knows when death is coming? And so these are some reflections on Samvega, but an important point to make is we shouldn't practice Samvega with anxiety and agitation that's overstimulated. We need to practice it with clarity and confidence that allows us to practice without being maniacal, being throwing away all our possessions and running around saying nothing else matters. We need to practice in a balanced way, almost like a kind of calm urgency, a kind of practice that is supported by faith, knowing that just by doing these good beneficial things, practicing ethical conduct, practicing generosity, developing our mind, all of these things are already moving us away from unwholesome tendencies towards wholesome states. And this urgency that we need to feel is just the stimulation, this jolt, this shove, this kind of push towards the spiritual path. And it's something that is like that first step that we take on a journey. It's that first step which is often the hardest to take, but the most important. That sense of urgency, that sense of inspiration, that Samvega, is something which will lift us up and push us forward on the path. So I look forward to continuing this discussion with you in the Zoom session and looking at all those other areas of Samvega that we can explore as a group. And thank you for paying attention. I hope it's been stimulating, and I hope you will remember the truth of old age, sickness and death, and use this concept of Samvega in your life to continue to support your practice and lead you towards liberation.